She'd never run so fast. Up the hill, across the brambles, running and running until the stitch in her side demanded her to stop. Her knees buckled. She grabbed her stomach and kept pushing onward. It was dark now, inky and black, and she thought quite briefly she should have stayed. Let the pastor do what the Hitchcocks paid him for, lock her into sickness and health, for better or worse, so much worse, till death do they part. But when the pastor awaited her response for her to say she would honor and obey, she looked into Cooter Hitchcock's tiny, mean eyes. Her life flashed forward all the way to its end. No, not with him. She obeyed her gut and ran until her foot hit a stump in the middle of the path. She stumbled and sprawled face first into the briar. They stung as they bit into her cheeks and neck, and when she managed to pull herself up to her feet, she saw what lay before her. The path was no wider than a deer trail. It zigzagged through a brown, swaying meadow overgrown with thickets, thorn bush, and generations of neglect. And atop the hill where the zigzag ended, a house. Too small to be a mansion, too big to be a tumble-down. A manor. A long-forgotten Gothic Victorian, once a glorious place to live. It bade her come closer, with only the light of the rising moon upon it. Emma gathered her gown's short remnants and forced herself toward the strange refuge. Angry thorns and stinging nettles burrowed into her flesh and sliced at her legs. The stitch in her side grew hot and spread like a poker from a fire being drawn across her insides. She defied the pain, hearing the twigs and sticks snapping like kindling beneath her slippered feet as she ran. Beneath her struggling breath, Emma cursed the picture books. Those wretched catalogues of hopes and dreams, the beautiful wedding gowns, the etched illustrations of happy wives and husbands and children, which she and her friends rifled through when the nuns allowed them recess. They must be quick now, before the sisters see. They should have known better, even then. Emma held no aspirations thanks to her gender. Also no parents, family, or dowry. When Cooter Hitchcock set his sights on her, she should have been grateful. He told her so many times, especially in the throes of his nightly inebriation. He'd say she needed to be more appreciative, con sonnet, and eased her pretty little head by promising to marry her some day. Emma was such a lucky girl. Emma chortled. The giant, triumphant spires penetrated the night sky so much more powerfully than the booze-soaked impotence she had grown used to. Her sniggering withdrew immediately, the moment she reached the manor's main gateway. The house sat as an asymmetrical bird on an acres-wide nest of thistlebush. Its foundation moaned into the earth, its gables, railings, balconies all but gone, their hinges rusting away. Only the decorative molding suggested traditional elegance, like the face, lips, and eyes of a cadaver, after the undertaker has presented it properly. Nearly every window cracked and fogged with grime. As Emma grew closer, she could observe some of the remaining panes were made of stained glass. Faded blues, small hints of forest green, but on most of them a strange muted shade of crimson, sable crimson. Not so much precision artwork, rather smudged, smeared, a child's finger painting gone horrifically wrong. She looked to the topmost gable where a curtain once blew in the field winds to a unique circular glass, that of a porthole on a sailing vessel, and Emma thought perhaps the father had instructed the architect to design it that way for his sons, that they may play pirate, or his wife and daughters to have lovely tea parties on the imaginary deck of a grand ocean liner. Whatever the patriarch had in mind, it was of no consequence to her. Emma set her shoulders square, her posture rigid, to realign her drifting mind. She would not allow it to muse on dreams and fantasies of what real families may be like. Families she would see from the orphanage windows, always selecting someone else. She made her way through a skeleton of a wrought-iron gate and faced the veranda. On the weedy cobblestone, a feminine figure in black stood in repose in a courtyard's crumbling remains. The merry refrains of ghost children's laughter echoed around them. The woman in black ran the thin tip of her finger against the ashen rim of a parched, fractured bird bath.
"Begging your pardon, madam,"
Emma said, raising her voice to a hoarse whisper. Surely the woman was dressed for mourning, and Emma did not wish to intrude, but her circumstances precluded such inane formalities.
I am in need of help, of assistance for—"
The dark madam's finger raised to her lips. Her face was obscured by a veil of tulle netting, and her gloves of ebony kidskin. A dusty veil shrouded her face until shining white teeth appeared behind it in a thin, eerie grin. Then, riding upon the night breeze, and within the courtyard's spirit's noiseless clamor, the distant barking of the dogs. Emma looked quickly over her shoulder. She could see nothing as of yet, but soon enough the bastard's torch would appear over the horizon.
"Do you hear them? They are his dogs. They are meant to find me,"
Emma said, turning back to negotiate with the silent spectre before her.
"I beseech you, good lady, I have nowhere else to hide."
The madam's head bowed to her chest. Is that a yes? Emma thought as the madam turned, clasped her hands to her breast, and raised her head to the topmost part of the manor, where the curtains once blew. She spun suddenly toward Emma. Her skirts ballooned around her ankles, and Emma saw thick, dried mud caked on the frays of the hem, the buttons on her boots coated with the same, as if she stood out here for long spans of time. Her smile, her slight and mysterious grin grew wider through the veil. The madam gestured graciously and bowed with sophisticated politeness.
"Thank you so much,"
Emma said, and took the first stair. She feared it would split in two as she set her weight against it. She turned to look back at the dark madam, yet she was already returned to the bird bath, tracing the rim as one would with fine crystal to make it sing. The stair did not split, but it did sag quite severely. Emma pushed open the heavy mahogany door and made her way into the foyer, where refined and cultured guests were once welcomed, long, long ago. Oil in the lamps glowed the yellow of jaundice, illuminating threadbare tasseled shades. Portraits of sophisticated ladies and gentlemen browned with age were wrapped as mummies in gauze cobwebs. Mildewed wallpaper peeled and hung like boiled skin. Wooden slats shone from behind the paper, the manor's skeleton greeting her. Emma covered her mouth, shielding her senses from an astonishing stench, like refuse from the butcher's block, much like the one from the back alleyway where she first met Cooter Hitchcock. The nuns told her later that she was a harlot and deserved it. They demanded Emma pray for forgiveness from the Lord, that Emma's only soul-saving grace would be weeks of repentance to reproach her sexual sin. Emma was only 13 at the time, but learned enough to deliver a solid kick to Sister Mary Margaret's shin when she thrust her rosary at Emma's bruised and battered face. Emma heard the dogs again. The barking and the howling easily traversed the manor's thinning walls. She would make her way to the center of the house, wait it out behind a cupboard or beneath a table until the sun rose. Cooter Hitchcock wouldn't step one cowardly foot inside. Emma ventured a step, then another, to cross the foyer, past the entry hall sofa, its haggard upholstery torn to shreds like her dress, and an unseen young woman leapt from the cushion. She shrieked a banshee's cry, throwing knives into Emma's eardrums. Too late did Emma cover her ears, and the shrieking resounded as a hellish echo, and Emma turned to run, but the shadow's piercing scream began to ebb. And when it finally did faded away completely, the young woman sat back down as before, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she rocked back and forth, weeping, sobbing in whispers that no one could hear. She was dressed all in black, just as the madam outside. She looked to be in mourning as well, and Emma concluded something most terrible, most inhuman must have happened to cause the woman to behave so, to cause the manor to fall into such a state of disrepair. The grey vapour of warm breath meeting cold air clouded all around her. Emma's palms went suddenly sweaty, yet cold, and she stuffed them beneath the pits of her arms. How was it so frigid so suddenly? Should there not be a fireplace? With people alive within the manor, are they not chilled as well as she? Emma carefully stepped past the weeping lady to the sitting-room. No place to sit now, Emma thought as she took in the ghastly remnants. Once splendid furnishings were tattered and ragged. Chairs and love-seats leaned on broken legs. A library's worth of volumes and books were crammed and had fallen from shelves that stretched to the ceiling.
A library once belonging to whom?
Emma wondered.
Perhaps the man. Is that what it was? A man? Sitting in the chair beside the unlit hearth.
She stepped closer, the rug on which she trod creaking, logged with water. It was as if she stepped onto the deck of an abandoned ship. It smelled as one, too, dank and ripe with mildew. She was almost to the man, nervously glancing at the diaries, journals, notes of lives gone by scattered upon the floor. The wickedest of windstorms surely took its toll on all these paper memories. Emma ran her finger beneath her nose. Chills always made it seep, and reached out to tap the man's shoulder. Just behind her, the other man slammed his book. "Story time!" he shouted, and Emma spun around, the towering figure rising from the corner. He glared at her with crazed, steely eyes. His hair was white past his shoulders, as hair continues to grow long after the body has been buried. "Time for a story. Do you not want a story? There are many, many tales to tell. Lore of the folks, the legends and myths, deadly murderous books." Dried rivers of rusty red smeared from the neckline of his high-collared shirt, and he took a large stride in her direction. Too long a stride, as if his legs were half the length of the room. His entire monstrous frame drifted effortlessly above the ragged carpet. Again she ran, through a corridor, a passage, and the smells here became even more gruesome. She heard not the story man's footfalls, but as his feet never really touched the floor, Emma found little comfort in the noiselessness. She did not see him recess back into the shadows, where he was wont to stay. The story-man stayed in the shadows always, remaining eternal in his ever after. Then mushrooms, the smell of mushrooms, of dirt and fungus, and as much as Emma wanted to believe her encounters in the manor were no more than figments of her visions, she knew too well delirium had no aroma. Her stomach rolled in an acidic turn when she stopped before the dining-room table. It was precisely set for a magnificent feast. The diners for which it was intended were long gone now, but what was to be their supper remained. A feast instead for the maggots, the flies, the squirming cream-colored larvae that writhed and twisted on a fancy head of lamb? Yes, certainly lamb, just as they were at the butcher, although she never recalled seeing one's entire severed head presented on a plate for general consumption, like a roast turkey. The remains of its eyes stared overhead while its tongue lolled out of its mouth, like Cooter after he'd had a few shots of rotgut. She pictured his own head on the platter.
Who's there?
It's the as white as snow.
Emma clamped her jaw. A child's voice. Sing-song, the coo of a nursery rhyme coming from the kitchen.
1, 2, 3, can't find me.
Emma darted across the floor as supper watched her with its big, soulful eyes. The kitchen, cataclysmic, a veritable graveyard of pots and pans, a war zone of bloody dishes and cutlery. An icebox covered in crimson splatter stood as a sentinel at the end. Yellow-grey cheesecloth and likewise stained linens hung from the cupboards, where Emma concluded she would not be hiding, and all around hacked-up remains of blackened entrails, the stench of a relentless cesspit of sewage and waste. The child snickered. It sounded much like how a youngster stifles his laughter in church with one hand clasped over a giggling mouth. Much like Emma and her friends in the long ago, when they would titter with delight as they pored through the catalogues, imagining themselves as brides, as mothers. The giggling echoed quietly, hanging in the air as a happy cloud, then stopped. Nothing but the creaking of the manor, the howling of the winds outside, and the faint cry of the hounds.
On with you now.
Emma told herself, gathered the skirts of her gown, and took a determined step to the window, shards of which looked as though they could slice the throat of a bull or a lamb.
You're it!
The child sang as she spilled from the icebox. Her face was a ghostly blue, the lips purple, her eyes bugged out from their sockets as eyes do bulge when the body suffocates. The girl laughed and ducked back inside as quickly as she'd come. Emma took firm hold of the handle and tore the door back open. Worms crawled in and worms crawled out of dead rats, half a squirrel, a quarter finch. Roaches, very much alive, scurried around the remains of what may have been a cheese casserole. This time Emma could not control her gorge. It rose out of her throat, burning and hot as it came up, filled her mouth, and splashed across the entirety of the kitchen floor. It smelled of beets. And now, beside the window, she could hear the dogs again. Closer still, closer.
Ollie, ollie, oxen free!
The dead girl was not in the icebox, as the pitter-patter of little feet above her did attest. And the dogs, distinctive, the miserable, nasty gruff of the crossbreeds with which Cooter terrorized the townsfolk. Emma ascended the dim spiral of stairs. She could hear the girl, her stymied little laugh coming ever upward. Emma's hand ran the length of the banister, greasy with slime, yet sharp with painful splinters. Her skirts gathered in her other, so that she would not fall, tumble back down to the realm of the story man, the dark madam, the sad and sobbing woman in the foyer. The landing swayed with her weight, trembling as a china cup on a saucer of porcelain. Emma heard that too, heard the trembling, muttering, nonsensical words. The dead girl was still in the upward, her steps climbing, always above Emma's head. She was not the one who mumbled, no, this came from one of the others, and this one sat in the solarium of the second floor. In her hands a porcelain saucer, near her lips a china cup. She spoke to it. The brim of the china cracked and slivered, and Emma thought surely the lady would cut her mouth should she ever lift it past her chin.
It would be a shame,
Emma considered,
to mar such a handsome face.
For the lady was different from the manor's other residents. Her hair honeyed silver, sitting tastefully atop her head, with the right amount of bow and so many curls, cascading in salt and amber waterfalls to the small of her back. The cup did shake, terribly so, and the lady spoke to it, into it, her flawless skin the colour of the same fine porcelain from which she did not drink. Only her profile did Emma see, just one half of her exquisite beauty. It was enough. The lady must have charmed many a gentleman with but a fraction of its loveliness.
She may know,
thought Emma.
She may know what has happened here. Tell me if it is my imagination playing against me. Tell me who resides within these terribly abandoned yet not abandoned walls. She is normal like me. She will help me, hide me.
Emma collected her wits, all the while hearing the girl's footsteps run this way and that, one direction then the other, laughing and skipping.
Not quite a good hider,
Emma thought, and a long-forgotten grin etched just the very most corner of her mouth. She clasped her hands in front of her to make a sturdy, courteous introduction.
I beg your pardon.
Who's a pretty bird indeed, to your mother, to buy a fat pig, to market to mother, jiggity-jig.
The lady cocked her head aslight, as if hearing an invisible response to her ramble. Emma continued,
Do forgive my intrusion, yet, if I may...
Lovely lovely kitty cat you are. Come to mummy.
The lady spoke to no one. No person, certainly not to Emma, and certainly not a cat. Emma straightened.
Good lady, if it pleases you, to whom does this manor belong? I would want to offer my condolences, as well my thanks.
The ever-trembling cup went quiet, the good lady statue stiff. From such a pace away, Emma wasn't sure if the woman still breathed, and lo, even in the upward, the running footfalls ceased. No more laughter. Even the wind through the trees across the sky was silent. Until... Her head threw back, unhinging at the jaw. The bottom mandible slapped against her chest as she howled, and she turned the other side of her face to Emma. Burned from a blacksmith's torch hacked by a woodsman's axe, there was nothing of identifiable substance left. Strips of flesh intertwined with sinew. Blood, dried and caked upon what was once a cheek, broke off like pebbles, tumbled to the singed carpeting. One piece bounced onto Emma's foot. Emma kicked the good lady's scab off her slipper, watched her rise up from her chair as if lifted by marionette strings. The china cup rattling, trembling, and the eye on her pretty side stared straight through Emma's heart. The screams did not stop. They followed Emma all the way up the stairs to the attic, where the footsteps drummed against the flooring, the dead girl running in circles with her arms extended, running and running because she could fly, and behind her the moon shone through the porthole window of the gable. She giggled, and with her laughter the others joined in. The voices of the manor melded into one continuous blur, a damned chorus, off-key, no song the same as the words, "Ollie, ollie, pretty kitty, once upon a time, pretty kitty, ollie, ollie, snow as white as fleece," spun in Emma's head, her brain, and the chorus kept shrieking as the wind roared, breaking through the upwards window, allowing the dogs snarling to reach her, and they barked and howled, awful and victorious, as the dead girl spun and danced. Madness bled into realization. The mortal demons of this world had found her in this nest of the dead, where they read from moulded books and sat only to scream and drink invisible tea and play hide-and-seek in the ice-box. Winds blew harder, opening the portal window, carrying the baying of the dogs deep into Emma's ears. No matter how hard she squeezed her hands against her head, the howls would not cease, nor would the shrieks, and as the dead girl clapped gleefully, hopping up and down, though her feet no longer touched the floor, Emma ran. To the window. Toward the wind. It engulfed her, and as she fell to the ground below, to the thickets and the brambles and cobblestone, the last thing she saw was the dark madam's face, her shrouded lips unnoticeable until they parted into a grin. Welcome home.